Right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to our Rig Run webinar. This afternoon we are joined by Ken Bryson of Total Endurance, and he's going to be chatting to us about Supercharge your cycle. So without further ado, over to you, Ken.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Hi everybody and welcome.
Hi.
I hope I've got something that will be of interest to everybody. Please feel free to fire some questions in the chat if you want, and we'll try and look at them at the end. Just before I get into the presentation, got a few names to mention from the people who are the top 3 international bike winners for Rig Run. So in 3rd place, we had Scott Wilson of Ithaca on Captain WPP. 2nd, Jason Innes of Apache North Sea on Beryl Bravo. And the winner, Andy Hammer of Hammer Energy on Lomond. So well done to these guys. They obviously know lots about what they're doing on their bike. So hopefully everybody can see my presentation. Please let us know if you can't. What I'm going to be talking about is supercharging your cycle was the name we were given for the presentation. So the list of stuff there we're going to look at, but 2 main areas we're going to look at. We're going to look at bike position, and we're going to look at bike fitness and a little bit about training and what you might want to do in training to improve your cycling. But first of all, bike fit or bike position. So why is it important? Why is our position on our bike important? As in so many things, the key thing we're interested in is safety. So that's 2 things. First thing is the ability to control your bike. Obviously a bit less of an issue if you're riding a stationary bike in a gym or if you're offshore. And we can also put reduced injury risk into that box as well. We don't want to see people hurting themselves when they're riding their bike. Comfort. We want to be comfortable. There's nothing worse than spending an hour or 2 hours or whatever sitting on a bike not being comfortable. So comfort is a big driver. And that leads us on to efficiency. If you're not comfortable, the chances are you're not going to be very efficient when you're on your bike. What is efficiency? The ability to produce power and also reduce wind resistance. Again, if you're riding outside, obviously less of an issue, if you're training indoors, if you're offshore, or if you're in a gym. So a few things there to look at in bike position. First thing, and absolutely the most important thing in bike fitting, is saddle height. If you get the saddle height right, then everything else, there are other important things, but they're slightly less important than saddle height. And you've got to be able to pedal without rocking on the saddle. So we don't want to push our saddles too high, but if they're too low, we definitely risk knee problems and knee injuries. So there's a range of positions, but we want to be approximately at the right height. The simple method to do this is sit on the saddle in your normal riding position, put your heel on the pedal and push the pedal down so that the pedal is at the bottom of the pedal stroke. And without rocking on the saddle, your legs should be straight. If you do that, you won't be too far away from a good saddle height. It might be just slightly on the low side, but that's sometimes not a bad thing. So that'll give you a very quick estimate of, is my saddle at the right height on my bike, or is it not? What we do when we're doing bike fits is we use hip and knee angles, and also ankle angles to set the height. And it's better to be cautious. Actually, being very slightly too low is better than being slightly too high. So be a little bit cautious when you're doing it. Now, here's a couple of photographs. If we look at the top 2 photographs, knees a little bit too bent in the picture on the left. We've done some corrections there, and our knee angle's now about where we want it to be. And if you look at the ankle angles there, the ankle angle has also changed. So if somebody's saddle is too low, they tend to try and push their heels down to try and correct it. So you see a much lower ankle angle. So what we can see top right there is a good knee angle and a good ankle angle. If we go to the bottom two pictures, saddle's much too high. And actually this guy was rocking all over the place on the saddle because his saddle was much too high. Knee angle's very high, ankle angle's also very high. If we look at the correction on the right-hand side, the ankle angles come down and the knee angles, well, both in this case have come down, so much closer to the right place. And with a little bit of practice, you can start to tell just by eye whether somebody's saddle's about right or not. Particularly if you stand behind them and you can see their hips rocking from side to side, that's usually a sign that they're much too high. If you look from the side and they're really pushing their heels down to try and straighten their leg more as they pedal, then that's a pretty good indication that their saddle's a little bit too low. So get that right and you'll be in a reasonably good place. But there are some other things to consider. So saddle position. I'll show you a picture of this in a minute to explain it, but with the cranks horizontal, a plumb line from just below the kneecap should bisect the pedal axle. And you need to have your foot roughly flat as you do this. But if you find the bony lump just below your kneecap and just drop a plumb line from there, ideally we would like that to be close to bisecting the pedal axle. And remember, if you change the saddle position, you might have to readjust the height because moving the saddle back and forward effectively changes the height. So if we have a look here, yeah, this again is done in our software, but we can see a red line here coming through back of the kneecap, through the bony lump just below the kneecap, and there's a yellow dot there right in the center of the pedal axle, and we're bang on the center of the pedal axle there. So that's a pretty good position for saddle fore aft position. Saddle tilt. This is the angle of your saddle. And basically, we want your saddle to be either flat or very slightly tilted down at the nose. We definitely don't want to see it tilted a long way down at the nose, and we don't want to see it tilted up at the nose. And the way I do this is just put a straight edge along the saddle. And actually, all our phones now have got an inclinometer in them. So long as the bike is on flat ground, you can very easily see where you are. And generally, I would aim for somewhere between 0 degrees and 2 degrees down at the nose. So it's close to parallel or very close to parallel. You sometimes find people whose flexibility is not the best. Maybe they're a little bit tight in the hamstrings. It can help just to tilt the nose of the saddle down a little bit. But what it does do is puts a bit of extra weight onto your hands, having the nose of the saddle tilted down. So it's a balance between those two things. You know, sometimes you find if it's too far down at the nose, you're constantly pushing yourself back to stop sliding down the saddle. So somewhere between 0 and 2 degrees is a pretty good place to be. You often find that actually if somebody's saddle's too high, the first thing they'll do rather than lowering it is tilt the nose down. Likewise, if someone's saddle's too low, they'll quite often tilt the nose up rather than raising the saddle. So if you see somebody's bike with the saddle pointing way down at the nose, it's sometimes a sign that actually the saddle's too high and then they need to adjust it, tilt it down a little bit. The saddles are a very personal thing. And I guess for some of you guys who you're offshore, you don't have a lot of choice in the saddle because it might just be on a stationary bike. But certainly on your own bikes, if you've got it in the right place and you've got your saddle height right, and it's still really uncomfortable that you can't sit on it for reasonable periods of time, once you've spent some time just adapting to it, if it still isn't good, it's well worth trying another saddle. Because there's lots of varieties of saddles out there in terms of widths, and some saddles that are better for people with better flexibility, some that are better for people with less flexibility, and also depending on the type of riding you're doing. So if you find your saddle's not really working for you, then it's well worth trying another saddle. Also, you'll always find that a saddle will feel more uncomfortable on a stationary bike, just because the bike's not moving around. You're not, there's very little movement going on. You're fixed in the same position, so they always feel a bit more comfortable when you're outside riding, because you're getting out the saddle more, the bike's moving around underneath you, so you're always moving a little bit. So once we've got our saddle height right, we've got it right fore aft position, and we've got the tilt right, we can start looking at the handlebars. Handlebars generally, on an exercise bike, they're much less of an issue. So long as you're comfortable, that's really the key thing. But it doesn't do any harm to have it adjusted as close to your own bike if you're riding your bike at home, because at least then you're getting used to riding in that position. So definitely some safety issues around handlebar position. We don't want you stretching too far to reach the handlebars, but we also don't want them to be too close to you, because that makes the handling of your bike twitchy, and it makes it a little bit less easy to handle. So quite important to get it approximately right. Your handlebar width on a road bike with drop handlebars should be about the same width as your shoulders, so that your arms are coming pretty much straight up rather than being out at an angle as they would be on a hybrid bike or a mountain bike. On that type of bike, you're sitting more upright, so there's less weight on your arms. So having your arms wider, particularly if you're riding off-road, helps with control. But for a road bike, we want your handlebars to be roughly the same width as your shoulders. And then we've got two adjustments. We can adjust the reach, and we can adjust the height, certainly on most bikes. Now, to adjust the reach, generally, we've got to change the stem. But you can get stem lengths from about 40 millimeters up to probably 140 millimeters. So there's potentially quite a lot of range adjustment there. You will find that if you go for shorter stems, the handling of the bike starts to feel a bit twitchier. The bike starts to feel a bit more nervous. So you don't want to go for too short a stem. And you can adjust the height usually by moving spacers on the steerer. So you can have spacers either above or below the stem to adjust the height up and down. Quite a good way just to check if you're in the right place is to sit in your normal riding position with your hands on the brake hoods. And if you look down at the handlebars, the front hub, in the center of the front wheel, should be obscured or roughly obscured by the handlebars. So you're looking right down at the center of the front wheel. That means your weight distribution on the bike is good. Your handling should be quite good, but you still don't want to be too stretched out in that position. But that's a very easy check. From there, if we start to look at angles, we're looking for a short shoulder angle somewhere between 85 and 90 degrees. And a back angle somewhere between 30 and 50 degrees. If you can get into those sort of positions, then you're in a pretty good place. And there we see, this is the same guy whose knee alignment we looked at a few minutes ago. We've got that from hip to shoulder down to wrist, we've got an angle of about 86 degrees, and we've got a back angle of about 37 degrees. You can actually see here, it would have been possible to move these spacers here to lower his bars if we wanted to. But in this case, we decided that actually that's a pretty good position for the type of riding he's doing. He looks comfortable, he felt comfortable. So we just left it exactly where it was. So have a quick look at a little case study. This was a guy I had in for Bike Fit quite recently, and he was actually quite a good runner, but he started cycling. He'd gone to a local bike shop, he'd bought a bike, and he'd said to them, it feels like I'm really stretching to reach the handlebars. So the bike shop had fitted a shorter stem, which we can see here between his handlebars and the steerer. And this was the position they'd left him in. So we did some angle measuring. We can see his knee angle here is far too low. Actually, his ankle angle is okay. But the other thing that was immediately obvious was the nose of the saddle was tilted up. As we said before, that's pretty typical when people saddles are too low. They tend to tilt the nose up to try and correct it. But what that's doing there is actually making his pelvis tilt backwards, so he's hanging off the back of the saddle and he's struggling to reach the handlebars. I think from memory they'd fitted a 60mm stem on the bike. So first of all, we got his saddle flat and we started just moving it up a bit. So we can see that knee angle is improving, and we're aiming for something probably around about 140 degrees there. So put it up a little bit more. Now we're getting pretty close to that 140 degrees. And suddenly he said he didn't feel like he was stretching so much anymore. So saddle's in at roughly the right angle and we're getting closer to the height and he's not stretching anymore. So we managed to get him back on actually the stem that had originally come with the bike, which the shop had changed out. So his riding position's improved. He's going to be a bit safer because his handling's going to be a bit better. And really the problem was nothing to do with the stem. The problem was actually that the saddle angle was all wrong and the saddle was too low. So once we get the saddle corrected, everything else starts to fall into place quite nicely. Foot position on the pedal. This is, whether you're using shoes with cleats that clip into the pedals or you're just using flat pedals, it's still good to get your foot in the right position on the pedal. And the way to do this is find your first metatarsal joint and your fifth metatarsal joint, basically the joints on your big toe and your little toe, and it's usually actually the widest point of your foot, so it's pretty easy to find even in your cycling shoes. Not difficult points to find. Identify those when you've got your shoes on, and we'd like to see the pedal spindle, the pedal axle, being underneath at the center point of a line between those two joints. Rotationally, again, particularly if you're using cleats, we want your feet to be at their natural angle when they're on their pedals or close to their natural angle. The best way to find out what that is just sit up on something where your feet are dangling off the ground and have a look at the angle your feet sit at. For probably 80% of people, their feet, their heels are slightly turned in and their toes are slightly turned out in that position, but not everybody. And if you're not in that position, we want you to adjust it to where adjust the cleats to where your feet should be. If you're just using flat pedals, you'll probably find your feet will naturally go to that position, but it's still worth thinking about the front to back position. If your foot position is not right, it can cause knee problems, and you usually feel it on the inside or the outside of your knee, particularly if you're using pedals and cleats with no float on them. So if we have a look at that in a picture, we can see the red line here is the center of the pedal axle. The fifth metatarsal joint is on one side, so it's just behind the pedal axle, and the first one's just in front. So with your foot at a nice, nice and flat on the pedal, with the pedal horizontal, or the cranks horizontal, it's very easy just to make sure. And even if you're just using normal shoes on flat pedals, it's worth getting your foot into that position because you'll be more efficient and more comfortable with your feet in that position. Okay, some common problems that you may feel. Pain at the front of the knee usually means your saddle's too low. Now, the opposite, pain at the back of the knee, usually means you're putting a bit too much stretch on the muscles in the back of your leg, so your saddle's too high. Pain at the side of the knee, as we've just mentioned, is usually related to the rotation of your foot on the pedal. Saddle discomfort could be your saddle's too high. It could be that the saddle tilt is wrong. It could be that actually it's just not the right saddle for you. But quite often, if somebody's saddle is too high, they'll complain that the saddle's very uncomfortable. And once the height's right, it feels better. Numb feet usually means that the cleats on shoes are too far forward. So your foot's too far back and the pedal's a little bit too much under your toes rather than the ball of your foot. Numb hands can be saddle is tilted nose down. Sometimes the bar is a little bit too low. Neck and shoulder discomfort, bars are too low or your stem's too long, so you're stretching too far. Lower back pain, lower back discomfort, saddle's too high sometimes, so you're rocking on the saddle rather than sitting nice and firmly on the saddle, or the bars are too low. So if you're suffering from any of those things, just try a little correction, make a few little adjustments, see if you can make a difference to it. Okay, so that's a very, very fast run through bike fitting. We can get some questions if anybody's got any questions on that once we run through the next section. So if you've got any questions, just hold on to them for a few minutes and we will come back to them. And this is as much an opportunity for you guys to ask questions rather than me just sitting here talking to you for the whole time. But we're going to talk a little bit about training on your bike. And the training that you're going to do depends very much what you want to get out of it. If you're just training to keep fit, then just getting on your bike and riding is going to do quite a lot for you. If you want to genuinely be improving your performances, then you might want to think a little bit more about what training should I be doing to do that. And the biggest mistake we see with people training in cycling and running and other sports is that they do all their training quite hard. So it's never actually, they never do longer, steady efforts, and they never do shorter, harder efforts. Particularly for people who are working offshore, you can do shorter, harder stuff offshore, and if you have a bit more time when you're at home, you can do longer, steady sessions at home. Generally, a lot of people do the longer, steady sessions too hard, and the shorter, harder sessions too easy. So getting a bit of differential between the longer, steady stuff and the shorter, harder stuff can really make a big difference to your bike fitness. And I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 training intensities. First one is aerobic endurance, and this is longer, steady efforts. If you're riding at this sort of intensity, you should be able to hold a conversation with somebody. You might be making slightly shorter sentences, but you should be able to hold a conversation as you're training. Quite a good way to think about what does this feel like is if you imagine when you start exercising, the first thing that happens is you start breathing a little bit deeper. As the intensity goes up, you eventually get to the point where actually just breathing deeper isn't getting enough oxygen in. So you have to start breathing faster. And that's about the point we want to be doing this training at. So it's fairly comfortable, depending on how long you're going for, obviously. Steady, I mean, it's not slow, but it's a steady effort. And the reason for doing this is it improves your economy, so you get more efficient on your bike. It will reduce your resting heart rate because it increases the stroke volume of your heart. And reduced heart rate is always a very good sign that you're getting fitter. It actually increases the amount of blood you've got in your body, which means you can transport more oxygen around your body to the working muscles. And it creates new blood vessels in your muscles to help get more oxygen into the working muscles. It also increases your ability to use fat to fuel the effort we have. So that means that we're saving our carbohydrate reserves, because we all have very limited carbohydrate reserves in our bodies. So we don't want to burn them up too quickly. And even the thinnest of us have fat to fuel an effort for days on end. So increasing your fat usage allows you to ride faster for longer. Also, doing this sort of training allows you to train harder and recover quicker if you're moving on to harder training or aiming for a race or an event or whatever. Anaerobic threshold. So this is harder work. This is the intensity you can just maintain without going into the red. And by going into the red, I mean getting to that point where your breathing gets out of control. You start to feel that burning sensation on your legs, and you can't keep it going for very long before you have to slow down. So your anaerobic threshold is just below that point there. So you can just maintain a steady effort. You can think of it as, you know, about the intensity that if you were to ride all out for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, that would be about what you'd be able to maintain. So generally for training for this, you better to do it as interval training. And you can either do that as shorter intervals at about bang on that intensity, or you can do slightly longer efforts at about 90% of it. And if you're on a bike with a power meter or a stationary bike with a power meter, you know, the power meter will give you a pretty good indication of where you are. And what we're trying to do here is increase our speed at that threshold and increase the time that we can maintain it for. But you don't want to do this type of training every day. Even when you're offshore, if you're only doing shorter sessions, I wouldn't be riding this hard every day. I'd be doing some easy stuff in between. Maybe a couple of times a week, you can do this type of training. And the final intensity I want to talk about just very briefly is VO2 max. Now, this is the point where you're taking the maximum amount of oxygen into your body, transporting it through your lungs, into your blood, into your working muscles. So it's hard work. You'll be out of breath and you'll be working really, really hard. An average person, we measure it in milliliters per kilogram per minute, so it's related to body weight. You might find an average person has a reading of about 35. An elite male athlete will be somewhere between 65 and 80. And it is trainable. It's not as trainable as some other things, but it is something we can train. And it will help you to increase your speed at that intensity. It'll help you to increase the amount of oxygen you can take into your body. It's well above the anaerobic threshold we just talked about. It's maybe 15 to 20% higher than that. And quite a good way to think about it is it's about the intensity that you could maintain with an all-out effort for 5 to 6 minutes. So a good way to do it is in intervals of between 1 and 3 minutes with basically the same amount of recovery as the effort you've done. It'll really push your fitness on doing some training at this level, but again, don't do it too often. And probably if you haven't been doing all that much on bike training, it's probably better to leave it until you've done a reasonable amount of the sort of steady aerobic stuff before you try this, because it is hard and it will make you tired. You need time to recover after it. But if you can think about those 3 training intensities, you won't go too far wrong in your training, and hopefully your bike fitness will improve. Make sure you get your position right and then have a look at some of this stuff. So just to wrap all that up, conclusions, most important thing in bike fit is to get your saddle height right and to be comfortable. If you've got that and your bike handling feels good, then you're probably in a pretty good place. Mix up your training. as much as you can. Don't do the same stuff all the time. Try and mix it up, make it a little bit more interesting. Make up some interval sessions you can do. Don't do back-to-back high-intensity sessions. But when you're offshore, or if you're limited for time, focus on the shorter, harder stuff. If you're at home and you've got a bit more time, focus on the longer, easier stuff. And above all, enjoy it. You know, it's a sport and a hobby. You can get a lot of benefit out of it. So just go out and enjoy it. Do it for enjoyment. Okay, thank you. If anybody has any questions, please fire away.
Wait to see if anybody comes up with any questions for you, Ken. That was absolutely fantastic. Lots of information there. That's really, really good. On average, Ken, how long does a bike fit take, and what's the sort of cost people would be looking at?
So it varies a bit, but normally for us, about an hour and a half. It can go up to 2 hours, just depending on what we do, and it depends a bit on the type of bike as well. But for a standard road bike, normally about an hour and a half, and the cost is £130. And for that, you get the bike fit, and then you get a full report afterwards with all the measurements we've taken. You get a link so you can see all the videos with all the angles that we've measured, etc. So you've got all the information there. You know, if you need to transfer it to another bike or whatever.
Perfect. Just seeing if anybody else is coming up with any questions for you here. Nothing as yet. Okay, I've got another one for you. This might be a can of worms for you now, Ken. So what are your thoughts on tyre width and pressures for people?
Okay, yeah, that is
a can of worms.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, that has, in the time that I've been cycle coaching, that has changed dramatically. I mean, you know, 30 years ago, I used to race on 18mm tires pumped up to 150 psi. Now I would say most people are probably using 28mm tires on road bikes. And with tubeless tires now as well, the pressures have come down. You know, the sidewalls of the tires are a bit stiffer, so the pressures that they're being run at are, you know, 80 to 90 psi probably now. It depends a bit on your weight and the conditions, but they're way lower than what we were using a few years ago. Gravel bikes, you know, I've obviously got even bigger tires on them, so that the tires over the years have got bigger and pressures have definitely come down.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I've got
give you oh, good. We got one.
Yeah, go on then. So what are your thoughts, Ken, on tubeless tires or technology? Because I've got a road bike, I've got more than one. I like my cycling. I got one with tubeless tires, and I've reverted back to kind of clinchers. So I'm back at 120 psi, you know, pressure in my tires now, because it's all right until you get a big puncture, and then you're a bit scuppered, aren't you? So I don't know what your advice would be in that area.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, because tubeless is becoming more and more popular. I mean, tubeless obviously came from mountain biking originally, and actually, although the technology is improving and it's getting better, it still works better on bigger tires. So things like mountain bike tires and gravel bike tires. On a road bike, I think it works reasonably well, but I would always still take a tube. You know, just in case you do get a problem that doesn't seal. And you're absolutely right, when you do get a puncture, it does make a horrible mess, because it's got the gloop inside the tire which seals the hole. So I would say for general riding, I know a bit like you, I've tried tubeless, and actually I have gone back to using tubes. If I was racing, I would definitely use tubeless, because there's more chance that it will actually seal a puncture if you get one, and you won't have to stop. For general riding on the road, I'm still using tubes, just because of the mess you get with tubeless. You know, if you have a puncture and you do have to take the tire off. But I would still say 120 psi with modern tires is probably a bit hard. And
Okay.
if anything, having gone to tubeless and then gone back from it, I've also stuck at slightly lower tire pressures, having got used to the tubeless tire pressures.
So what are your tire pressures now then with your tube?
I'm probably running at about 100 psi.
Okay.
And it depends a bit on weight. I mean, I weigh about, it varies a bit, somewhere 78 kilos, something like that. And I'm probably at about 100 psi nowadays, whereas I would, you know, a few years ago, I would have been the same as you at about 120 probably.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else got any questions? Nothing firing in. Okay, my last question for you, Ken.
Okay.
A bit like running, where someone's a keen road runner, and they mix it up a little bit with a little bit of trail running. Would you say if if you are out doing a lot of road racing and road cycling, that it's good to mix in a bit of mountain biking if you can?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you get you get a lot of different things out of some mountain biking or gravel biking. It's really good for your bike handling skills. The balance is a little bit different, and you're on slippier surfaces, so it really helps your your weight distribution on the bike, your balance on the bike, and also your handling skills, which are pretty important if you're doing things like road racing and sportifs and that sort of thing. You also get, you have to work pretty hard going up hills on a mountain bike or a gravel bike, so you also get good strength training out of it. So and it's a bit different, and it's good fun. So apart from that, yeah, it'll definitely help your skills. It'll help your fitness, and it's good to do. It's good fun. So yeah, definitely.
Perfect. So anybody else got any more questions? Nothing firing in. Ken, I think that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for that. There's lots of information for people there. Obviously, everybody can review that on the Rig Run Recovery Zone site. So you're more than welcome to go and have a look at that as well. So just again, a round of applause for Ken. Thank you very much, Ken. And hopefully we will see you all at the next webinar when we've got one coming up. So just have a look at the calendar and see what we've got coming up next, and hopefully we'll see you at the next thing. Thank you very much, Ken. Yeah, thanks everybody. And we're in Aberdeen. If anybody has any questions about bike fitting or any of the other stuff we've talked about, please feel free to look us up and give us a shout. Yeah, get to see Ken over at Total Endurance. That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.